What were you told to keep secret about a company you worked for, but you don't work there anymore, so F those guys? Story 1. After working as a contractor at a well-known social networks data center early in my career, you may guess the name. I can say that the CEO doesn't care about contractors or their work. He prefers contract workers because 1. They're cheaper, and 2. They can be fired at will. Don't believe me? The CEO said it himself. Every week he hosted a private Q&A only full-time employees could attend. There were 3 to 4 full-time server technicians at each data center. In one session, he was asked why the company employs so many contractors, from bus drivers to cooks to maintenance crews. He said it was because contractor work is not critical to the business. In his view, having mostly contractors, especially outsourced ones, makes him happy because it lines his pockets. Also, the site manager at the data center where I worked, let's call him Bob, was investigated twice for SA, but nothing happened because he was too critical to the location. He later fired the woman who reported him. This is one reason, among others, why I will fight tooth and nail to prevent that CEO from ever holding public office. He wants a workforce modeled on his preferences, full of temp contractors, mostly outsourced. While this might boost the economy superficially, it leaves workers vulnerable and disposable. Before we continue, do us a quick favor, smash that like button and subscribe to support our channel. Story 2. I worked at a big retail store giant for several years as an assistant store manager. I'm female, and I was paid between $10,000 and $40,000 less than any male I encountered across different states. Around late 2003, I received a strange email sent to all management company-wide. It detailed a new payroll policy capping wages at around $8 an hour and instructed managers not to tell employees. The goal was to cut payroll costs, a pure injustice. Shortly after, we were told to delete those emails, which were automatically deleted. Many selfish managers supported this because it put more money in their pockets. Here's a story about Frank, a hard-working retired gentleman in one of my departments. He wanted to move to Florida and continue working part-time at the store, switching departments. I was advised not to tell him that his pay would reset to the department's lowest rate, around $8, with tiny yearly raises if he was lucky. Frank had worked for decades at this particular retail franchise and was making about $14 an hour. I refused to deceive him. I explained the new policy and how it would impact his decision. He cried. He'd already bought a retirement home and relied on his current wages. I hate this company. I have many more horror stories if anyone wants to hear them. Also, never buy great value brand food. People have found glass, plastic, and cardboard bits in it. Never become a manager there. They will exploit and abuse you without mercy. They deserve the deepest hell. If you think you save money shopping at this retail store, you're wrong. They invest millions in squeezing every red cent from your wallet. I haven't shopped there in years, and I don't miss it. Story 3. I never worked for popular pizza franchise directly, but I worked for a non-profit that job coached a few employees with disabilities there, so I saw everything happening behind the scenes. If carrot sticks on the salad bar got moldy, which happened often, since no one really ate them and they sat out for too long, management would tell employees to scrub off the mold under running water and put them back on the salad bar. If a fly landed on something like the pudding, employees were told to simply scoop it off with a spoon and continue serving it. One time, the assistant manager got hand-foot-mouth disease. The general manager didn't permit him to take sick days, so he came to work and kneaded dough with his blistered, infected hands. A job coach later contracted the illness after working there, passed it to her 2 sons, who then spread it at their daycare, resulting in a local outbreak. A few months ago, when the local outlet was having financial issues, they were instructed to fire all the disabled. As an advocate, I reached out to an employment lawyer, who confirmed this was a direct violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, and that the employees had every right to sue. Sadly, none of them or their families wanted to pursue legal action, fearing backlash in our small town. I no longer job coach at that company. Story 4. When I was a Marine, I was a certified mail carrier for a while, which didn't mean carrying mail was my job, but meant it was something extra I had to do every few days. I was one of several people in my work section authorized to pick up the mail from the actual mail clerk for the entire work section, and then distribute it during the workday. It works this way because people who live in the barracks don't have their own mailboxes, and this is why when you mail things to military people, you address it to their unit. Anyway, the actual mail system in the Marine Corps is messed up. There are Marines whose actual job is working with mail, but every unit's mail clerk is a temporary position, usually 6 months, is poorly trained and is usually a crap bag, which is why they were disposable enough to get the temporary assignment away from their normal job in the first place. Things get routed to the wrong unit all the time. The mail clerks are supposed to send them back up to the real mail workers to get rerouted, but they often don't and let them just stack up until they hear an inspection is coming. And they just destroy or throw everything away to avoid getting in trouble. Because if they get caught sitting on mail like that, they can get into serious trouble. In addition to the normal seriousness of screwing with mail, in the military they can award you a forfeiture of pay and drop your rank. I've heard of cases where they actually opened and stole packages but don't have any first-hand knowledge of that happening. But I totally believe it. So yeah, if you're enlisted, you've probably had mail of yours destroyed by some crapbag mail clerk who got the position because they were totally inept at their real job. And if you ever mailed something to a service member and they said they never received it, now you know why. Story 5. I used to work at a well-known law firm in Charlotte, North Carolina, the kind led by a lawyer who appears in commercials all the time, and the experience was a complete nightmare due to the firm's absurd and controlling rules. Employees were not allowed to park their cars in reverse, were required to hold handrails at all times, and women were mandated to wear heels on the main floor because clients could see them through the firm's many surveillance cameras. The environment was oppressive and hyper-monitored, with management constantly trying to catch people making mistakes. Rather than firing employees outright, which would allow them to collect unemployment benefits the firm aggressively contested, they preferred to emotionally wear people down until they quit on their own. The final straw for me came when the marketing director, a kind woman I had worked with closely, sent a mass email exposing the toxic culture of the firm. She blind copied the entire staff, then disappeared, reportedly moving to Colorado. Initially, I thought the message had been sent to me in confidence, so I printed and deleted it to protect her, but I quickly realized that everyone had received it. Eventually, the email leaked to competing firms, triggering a company-wide investigation. Management interrogated employees in groups inside a dark conference room with no lights, asking invasive questions and threatening to fire and blacklist those involved. Nearly 3/4 of the staff went through this process. Although I wasn't responsible for leaking the email, I'm grateful someone did, as everything she wrote about Michael A. DeMeo was entirely true. I resigned shortly afterward, and it was the best decision I've ever made. Story 6. I worked at a well-known retail company's corporate office, and I witnessed numerous unethical practices during my time there. I was terminated abruptly in the middle of the day, without warning, notice, or a clear reason. I was forced to sign a document that essentially admitted fault, making me ineligible for unemployment benefits. I was also told it was nothing personal and that I could reapply for the same position, but at a significantly lower wage of $9 per hour compared to my original $13. The company's claim that wood sold there is made in the USA is misleading. It's actually scrap wood imported from elsewhere. The lifetime warranty for the tool line is also deceptive. There is no dedicated customer service, and if a manager refuses to honor the warranty, there is essentially no recourse for the customer. Employees were routinely pressured into taking so-called optional and anonymous surveys. However, if someone expressed negative opinions about management or failed to declare how much they loved working there, they were written up. The company also had a zero-tolerance policy toward employees purchasing items from its competition. If an employee was caught shopping there, or even seen in the parking lot, they could be terminated immediately. During my time there, we were instructed to downplay or deny veterans eligibility for year-long military discount. Even if they did qualify, we were told to rush through calls to avoid spending time on them because it cost too much. When the discount verification moved online, we were directed to tell older veterans to go to physical stores. Even though stores weren't informed of this process, the website crashed frequently, and employees were told to ignore calls from stores asking for assistance. The work environment was politically charged. My supervisor at the time spoke aggressively in support of Donald Trump, and if anyone mentioned Hillary Clinton, he would scream and potentially issue a written warning. He later left the company, not because of company intervention, but because he found another job. When I was hired, I was falsely told it was illegal to share my pay rate with coworkers. While it's not illegal, the company discouraged it heavily. The attendance system allowed for up to 10 occurrences, absences, but acceptable excuses were limited to medical emergencies, surgeries, or childbirth. When I was bitten in the face by a dog and my mouth swelled shut, preventing me from speaking, which was 85% of my job, I was nearly fired. Customer service was also poorly managed. Complaints deemed not serious were often ignored outright. Email complaints were even more likely to go unanswered. Protection plans sold with appliances were rarely explained properly. These plans become void if the product is taken out of state or serviced by anyone other than the store. They're also invalid for businesses, even home businesses, and the company doesn't clearly disclose these terms to customers. There are many more issues I could mention, but even writing this has made me angry all over again. My experience at this company was deeply disappointing, and I want others to be aware of what happens behind the scenes. Story 7. I worked for Vietnam Veterans of America, VVA, in Santa Rosa, California, a nonprofit organization that I later discovered was engaged in questionable and potentially unethical practices. While working there, I learned that VVA was leasing the use of its name to for-profit secondhand stores operating in several states. One notable example was the Red, White, and Blue store, which paid to use the VVA name. After the agreement, the stores would change their signage to Vietnam Veterans of America and begin collecting donations of clothing and household items. Donors believed they were contributing to the nonprofit VVA, but in reality the items were going to the Red, White, and Blue store, a for-profit business that obtained inventory for free and sold it at a profit. A journalist in another state eventually uncovered the scheme and began calling our office. He also spoke with employees at the stores, many of whom genuinely believed they worked for VVA. However, their paychecks bore the name of the Red, White, and Blue store or similar for-profit entities. In response, the VVA office in Santa Rosa entered the payroll services business. They began preparing payroll checks for various for-profit stores across the country. To employees, it appeared that they were being paid directly by VVA, as all paychecks listed VVA as the payer. The stores would reimburse VVA for payroll amounts and also pay a service fee for processing. VVA handled all federal and state payroll tax filings. When I first started working there, before I fully understood the scope of what was happening, I couldn't understand why the bookkeeper, who was notably underqualified and ineffective, was earning $60,000 a year for working only 3 days a week. This was approximately 30 years ago, making that salary even more suspicious at the time. Eventually, I came to the conclusion that she may have had leverage over VVA leadership, possibly threatening to expose the organization's activities unless she was paid what she demanded. Story 8. I worked as a deckmate for a prominent yachting and sightseeing company in Palm Beach County, Florida. Here are a few things that led to my explosive last day. The owner's wife, who clearly could do no wrong, was watching me tie up the bowline during docking. I completed the job perfectly, but she told the captain, also the owner, that my arm had been caught in the line and I almost got pulled off the boat. She was clueless about docking procedures. This led to my retraining, demotion, and 6 months of supervision just before I was due for a promotion. We were told to take pictures of all passengers before boarding and not allow them on unless their group was photographed. Customers didn't have to buy the photos, but they were available for $25 at the bar. If too many boarded without photos, we faced termination. God help you. If anyone tried to sneak in with a water bottle or candy bar, after 3 groups refused pictures, I was left off the schedule for 2 weeks. Favoritism meant that I and a few others were constantly scrutinized for not performing every boat duty simultaneously. We were told to make 2 rounds cleaning, then asked why we weren't cleaning. When we cleaned, 5 minutes later we were told to make rounds. There was no logic, just drama. The final straw, I was training a new kid on basic duties and docking. During docking, he froze under pressure. I took over quickly to avoid damaging the yacht. When the captain asked how it went, I took the blame, saying I took over due to bad weather, hoping to protect the kid's job. This triggered an explosion from all 3 captains, yelling at me. I walked out during their tantrum and closed the door in their faces. Story 9. I used to work for a bakery that was affiliated with a mission providing free meals and services to homeless people. The bakery funded the mission through product sales. The entire operation was shady. We used to joke that given the choice between an easy truth and a hard lie, they'd always choose the lie. For example, the president of the company received two paychecks, one for her mission work and one for the bakery. However, she had nothing to do with the bakery. We'd see her twice a day, once to clock in and once to clock out. The rest of the time she worked at the mission. Essentially, she paid herself twice for the same hours. But that's not even the story I want to share, just an example of their dishonesty. One Sunday evening, dough was being mixed in a giant industrial mixer while the place was otherwise closed. I used to work that shift alone, which I liked. Another woman occasionally worked it too, but she wasn't someone who should be near heavy machinery. She was careless. One day she decided to use a flimsy metal spoon to scrape the mixer bowl despite plastic scrapers being provided. She left the spoon in the bowl and it got shredded into the dough. She realized what happened after hearing the awful noise and stopped the mixer. But it was too late. The dough was filled with metal shards. A normal person would throw out the dough, not her. She pulled out the bigger pieces and kept using it. Security cameras caught the incident, and 3 days later, management confronted and fired her. Here's the worst part. Management knew there wasn't time to make a new batch. The bread made with that dough had already been baked and was ready to ship. Instead of canceling the order, they sent it out anyway. Their plan was to claim ignorance and let the woman take the fall if anything happened. I quit shortly after. I sent an anonymous complaint to the health department, but never heard back. Story 10. I work at a mall with a lot of shady stuff going on. The mall manager got her job through nepotism. Her family owns the management company, and she's completely incompetent. She has a payback scheme with one of the contractors who overcharges tenants and shares the extra profits with her. Rumor has it, they're also sleeping together. Nothing ever gets fixed or done. There were claims of massive embezzlement after it took 6 years and 20 different contractors to complete a bowling alley and nearly a year to finish a gym, all in spaces that were already prepped. Meanwhile, the roof leaks, bathrooms are covered in graffiti, water damage is eating away at the building, and the decor hasn't been updated in 25 years because they refuse to spend money. The food court has only 2 places open, a coffee shop and a spot that cooks food once a week and serves it all week to customers who seem to like it. The fire detection system hasn't been updated in over 30 years and is unreliable. Elevators and escalators frequently break down. During winter, doors stay closed because a tenant complains if the automatic doors at the only handicapped accessible entrance open. Stores are overpriced because of ridiculously high rent. The place is a bad place to work, with hobos and junkies harassing customers and breaking in overnight. Management refuses to fix doors or pay for 24-hour security. The mall is disgusting and poorly maintained. Nothing gets done until government officials threaten them. Also, I suspect they post fake reviews online. Story 11. I worked for a privately owned company that offered customized data programs as well as data entry and analysis services. We had a contract with Ontario's Emergency Medical Services. My job was to decipher and enter 15 years' worth of data from ambulance call reports covering 2 counties into a database designed by our company. This was to bring the province up to date before a major hospital merger in 2008. When the job was done, instead of pursuing another government contract, my boss sold her house and hurriedly moved out of the country with over $1 million. That's when I discovered the entire contract was illegal. Some hospital administrator didn't want to deal with the job they were assigned, so they illegally outsourced it to our company on the sly, allowing my boss to remove truckloads of classified documents off hospital grounds every week. I wasn't allowed to tell anyone because the scandal would have delayed the merger and cost the region a fortune in fines, investigations, and replanning. I hated being someone's dirty little secret. It felt really violating. I've been waiting a while for a thread like this. Screw Home Depot. They have a department called Home Depot Interiors, and I'm telling you, do not have your home remodeled by HDI. People, come on. I worked in the cabinet refacing department as a salesman for about 4 or 5 months before I got out. Anytime a salesman comes to your home with samples and a pitch, know that their commission on your remodel can be as high as 20%. That means if you buy a $20,000 kitchen remodel, your salesperson takes up to $4,000 just for selling the job and spending a few hours at your house. That's $4K you could spend on top-of-the-line appliances. Cabinet refacing itself is a waste of money. They spin it as an incredible service, but the only real benefit is the job gets done in 3-4 days instead of weeks with a contractor. I've had customers show me bids from contractors for literally half the price of refacing, and they would get a full remodel with brand new cabinets. The sales process is dishonest. You're taught to bend the truth as far as possible without outright lying. But after a while, you're told to lie, cheat, and basically steal from people. This includes over-measuring everything: countertops, cabinets, flooring to give you a higher price, and then discounting it to still make money. This kind of scam is common in virtually all in-home sales: solar panels, windows, vacuum cleaners, and security systems. Your haggling skills don't matter. These salespeople are sharks who want your money. It's a crooked culture that's hard to fix. Story 12. I live in Switzerland, so if you are Swiss, please boycott this company. I worked for a food startup called Farmy. They pride themselves on organic and vegan foods, claiming every product is sourced from regional farmers. That's a lie. Almost every day, I had to buy products from supermarkets, unpack them, and put them into labeled shopping bags to deliver to customers as a courier. About 60% of the bag contained customer-ordered goods. The rest were supermarket items. Farmers often couldn't deliver due to poor harvests. Instead of telling customers about shortages, management chose to deceive customers by substituting supermarket items for more expensive farming products, regularly overcharging customers by about 40%. On a typical day, I delivered about 40 bags, and there were 5-8 couriers. Do the math. One day, I decided not to unpack a cabbage and delivered it with the other items. The next day, the customer called demanding a refund. The company suspected it was me but couldn't prove it. Afterward, no couriers were allowed to buy supermarket goods. Instead, they hired a handyman responsible for filling the bags. Over time, I befriended him and secretly asked him to photograph every receipt. I wanted to send these photos to journalists to start a scandal but never did, not wanting to hurt my colleagues. Story 13. I used to work for a store that was part of a large EU chain of convenience stores. Our particular franchise treated employees like slaves. We were repeatedly underpaid, sometimes even below minimum wage for weeks at a time. Management ignored all health and safety concerns that they were legally obligated to address, and when these issues were eventually noticed, they simply blamed the employees. The store always operated with the absolute bare minimum of staff. I was told that if I ever called in sick, I would be fired because there would be no one to cover for you. At one point, they even tried to get me to drop out of college to work 34 days in a row, each day lasting 14.5 hours. When I refused, I was told I wasn't dedicated enough. There was also a mass food poisoning incident that was entirely covered up. My boss ordered expired food to be relabeled with new expiration dates. These were then sent to stores, and when the issue surfaced, she fired an innocent employee to take the fall. The store also ran a popular coffee franchise. My boss and the store owner would regularly delete transactions from the tills to keep some of the money for themselves, avoiding both franchise fees and taxes. We were forced to work grueling, illegal hours and were often denied breaks, though break time was still deducted from our paychecks. Sadly, this wasn't the end of the nightmare. I later moved on to a large restaurant that had just opened, only to experience more of the same. Employees were treated poorly and frequently underpaid, sometimes by as much as 10 hours a week. They purchased low-quality goods from suppliers, reboxed them, and falsely advertised them as made in-house, inflating the prices. They would also send employees home halfway through their shifts and force those remaining to juggle 2-3 roles at once, all for minimum wage. When we couldn't keep up with the unrealistic pace, we were scolded for being too slow. The company initially promised local hires more hours and better wages once the business stabilized. But as soon as it did, they fired almost all the local employees without warning, replacing them with cheaper foreign labor. Thankfully, the boss who oversaw all of this has since been fired and is currently under investigation. Story 14. I worked for a company that makes software to manage mortgages, software used by most major banks. Your data is not safe. Every time I pointed out security flaws in the system, I was dismissed for being overly cautious or told it wasn't worth the man-hours to fix. The reality is no one in the industry really cares about cybersecurity anymore. Here's why. The average developer only stays at a job for 1-2 years, since raises are rare. People move companies to get better pay. This creates a culture of indifference. Why would a developer care about securing the software when they know they'll be gone in a year? By the time a flaw is exploited, they'll already be off making more money somewhere else. Security becomes someone else's problem. In the US, there's little to no business incentive to secure software. If a company's data is breached and lawsuits happen, the company, not any individual, is liable. And if the company fails, start a new one. With the endless flow of venture capital, new startups pop up constantly. Everyone wants to be the next Google or Netflix, and investors throw money at anything with a pitch deck. There's barely any vetting. To cut costs, companies now hire developers who haven't even gone to school. Many of them don't understand basic security principles because they have no formal education or training, but they're cheap. Bottom line, your data is not safe, and unless industry priorities change, it's only going to get worse. Story 15. I worked at a college art gallery in Canada and was fired for confiding in a coworker that I was feeling depressed and had self-offing thoughts. I never did anything dangerous or made any threats, just admitted I was having a hard time after she asked why I'd been crying during lunch. The next day, an HR rep was there to fire me. They said it was due to budget cuts, but my boss had clearly been looking for a reason to get rid of me, and the coworker likely escalated the conversation. My boss didn't care about art or the students whose work we had only about elevating the gallery, whatever that meant. She had no idea how to use the museum content management system I was trained in and made no effort to learn. My contract was supposed to last a year, but they let me go after less than 7 months. Worse still, our gallery's most prized piece was a painting supposedly by a well-known First Nations artist. It had never been authenticated and was likely a fake. I spent months researching its provenance and found nothing to support its legitimacy. My boss told me to focus on more important things, and we continued to present it as genuine. Sadly, this isn't unique. Nearly every friend I have working in Canadian museums has had their contract cut short or been exploited. Museums are largely run by out-of-touch gatekeepers who rely on young people to handle modern tools while hoarding resources for themselves. They often use unpaid teenage or elderly volunteers to perform work that should be compensated. They're also deeply racist. Major Canadian museums routinely place white curators in charge of African and Asian departments. Worse still, their cataloging systems continue to include racial slurs like squaw or gypsy, with institutions claiming it's too difficult to change even as they preach about inclusivity. Story 16. The first thing you do every day at PetSmart is dump the dead reptiles into the trash. We treated them as well as we could. Once they were in the store given our fairly minimal resources, but they're often mistreated during transit and frequently die within a day of arriving. We once reordered a chameleon 3 times because they kept dying. Everyone knew chameleons were too delicate to transport, but head office insisted on having one in the store. Most employees aren't aware of this because management tries to sweep it under the rug, but I was the morning custodian. The birds are also neurotic due to sheer boredom, and the rodents bite because they are unsocialized. Elderly hamsters are put in the back room where they'll never be purchased because they make customers sad. From my experience, employees genuinely try to take care of the animals, but it's just not a good environment for them. The cats are okay though, since they're not actually sold by PetSmart. The company just lends display space to rescue groups and shelters. The cats are mostly happy and well cared for. If you're interested in helping an animal without going through a corporate pet store, your local shelter probably has birds and rodents who need homes. You can also ask PetSmart employees if they have any animals in the back, although that's a morally gray area, since they'll reorder another animal to replace the one you purchased. Story 17. I was a TA at a large university in the Midwest, working on my doctorate. One day, my laptop was stolen from my office. I filed a police report, assuming it was a lost cause, but only a limited number of people had access to that office, so it bothered me. I suspected someone, but had no proof. The building superintendent explained that a homeless man had been climbing over ceiling boards at night to get in. This had happened before. Curiously, my office mate had some checks stolen and attempts to cash them a few weeks earlier, so I believed something was off. Things don't just walk away from locked offices. A week later, late at night, I walked out of the bathroom to find my laptop and several valuables, including a checkbook, sitting in the janitor's closet down the hall. The janitor was cleaning another office. I grabbed everything, ran back, and called campus police. They took the report and collected the stolen items. The next day, the superintendent told me I had to amend my report because they found the items in the hallway and implied my enrollment was at risk. What he didn't know, I had already completed my graduate requirements and had copies of everything, so they couldn't legally pull my degree. I returned to campus police and told them the truth. It turned out the janitorial staff wasn't even scheduled to be there at that time. A week later, campus cops said they had to drop the case because it was resolved. I didn't trust this, so I called the real police. They took a report and were shocked. The detective said protecting students was a priority and thanked me. Months later, a newspaper article revealed the school had hired janitorial and grounds staff without background checks, paying under the table, including ex-cons and people with active warrants. The place was even used for drug distribution. The entire janitorial department was replaced, and a public apology was issued. I still got my doctorate. Story 18. I previously worked for a company focused on growing mushroom mycelium to develop sustainable packaging and related products. While the underlying concept held real potential, the company's operations were marred by poor leadership, inadequate safety practices, and unscientific research methods that ultimately compromised the integrity of the work and the safety of employees. The organization was led by individuals who lacked formal scientific training yet insisted on running the company's laboratory and research efforts without proper oversight. Rather than hiring professionals with advanced degrees in mycology or individuals with substantial laboratory experience, they consistently hired recent graduates from their own alma mater. There was a pervasive belief within leadership that reading articles and books was sufficient to replace structured scientific training. As a result, the laboratory's research lacked validity. Staff often failed to control variables in experiments, rendering their results scientifically useless. A notable example involved a funded research project that tested the effects of different growing temperatures on the product. Unfortunately, the incubators used were substandard and incapable of maintaining consistent temperatures, thereby invalidating the entire study. Safety protocols were virtually non-existent. In one alarming instance, I witnessed an employee standing on top of a cherry picker without a harness to weld a leaking pipe located near a 40-foot-high ceiling. Employees were also expected to retrieve large containers of highly concentrated hydrogen peroxide by climbing unstable shelving without any appropriate safety equipment or procedures in place. The company culture further deteriorated during mandatory staff retreats. Employees were expected to sleep on the floor in a crowded house with only 2 bedrooms or share space in a communal yurt. This blurred the line between professional and personal boundaries and created an uncomfortable environment for many. Lastly, the company's products frequently suffered from quality control issues. Items shipped globally were sometimes found to contain beetle eggs that later hatched, as well as a variety of mold contaminants. These oversights raised serious concerns regarding the safety, reliability, and reputation of the product. While the company positioned itself as an innovator in sustainable materials, my experience there revealed a troubling disconnect between vision and execution, one that endangered both its employees and its customers. Story 19. I worked at Blockbuster from 2004 to 2009, and nearly everything about the job revolved around upselling, whether it was food, rewards programs, or whatever new gimmick the company was pushing at the time. In the final years, most of the focus shifted toward trying to win back customers, but those efforts only sped up the company's collapse. One major push was the Blockbuster Rewards program. We were required to offer it to everyone for $9.95 a year, even to people who clearly didn't need it, like the elderly woman who only rented once a month. Only about 20% of customers ever benefited. One of the perks was a free rental each month, but it only applied to old, unpopular titles, something we weren't allowed to clarify. When it came to customer accounts, Employees were encouraged to write internal notes. If you were rude, constantly argued about late fees, or even just extremely nice, we'd document it. When your card was scanned, comments would flash up like "this man is cheating on his wife," "GF tries to use the account," or "this person is an a-hole, don't upsell." We eventually got in trouble when customers discovered they could request their full account history, which included these notes. The concession stand food was overpriced, but it sold well late at night. In 2004, there weren't many food options open at 2 a.m., so we took advantage of high customer traffic by offering deals like 6 candy bars for X dollars. We had access to new movie releases before the official street dates, but were told to lie if asked. Regulars would get honest opinions about movies. Others got rehearsed sales pitches regardless of quality. Blockbuster didn't implement employee breaks until 2007. Before that, we had to eat in between customers. When the company finally got caught violating labor laws, proper breaks were introduced. If a customer complained about a skipping DVD or game, we'd mark it with a small blue dot sticker near the barcode to track complaints. Sometimes we even put out visibly cracked games until we got 2 complaints, at which point we were required to destroy them. I always tried to warn customers about blue-dotted items, but managers got upset when I did. During the guaranteed movie phase, customers were promised a free rental if a popular title was out. This required handing out a card. If customers forgot or lost the card and later called in, we were instructed to lie and say we couldn't track it. Employee surveillance was intense. We were expected to constantly monitor customers for theft while also pushing upsells at every interaction. Around 2007, Blockbuster launched GameStation to compete with GameStop. They hired cool people, those with visible tattoos and piercings, because that was written into the recruitment guide. When the program failed, those employees had their hours reduced until they eventually quit. The company faced multiple lawsuits, at least 2 or 3. One resulted in a settlement requiring certain customers to receive long coupons and discounts. When these were printed at the register, they ran for 2 to 3 minutes. We were told not to explain them, just to say it was an expression of gratitude. The movie return box had to be checked hourly by policy. Even if I just emptied it, customers would blankly stare until I checked again. Many believed we had extra stock in the back room. Eventually, I stopped explaining and would just walk to the back and stand there for a minute to appease them. Finally, late fees were notoriously predatory. We had regular debates about whether they should be removed. If a customer was rude, the fee stayed. If they were polite, it depended on the employee. Eventually, fee waivers required manager approval. Story 20. The Georgia Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities, DBHDD, covered up one of the worst employee fraud cases in its history around 2014-2015. An upper management employee in a regional office was responsible for placing individuals with disabilities in group homes across Georgia. These regional offices were supposed to handle client placements fairly, allowing clients or their families to choose their homes, with support coordinators overseeing care. Instead, this employee ran a scheme targeting non-challenging clients. She instructed her support coordinators to manufacture reasons to remove clients from their chosen homes and place them in group homes she secretly owned. She had purchased over 30 group homes, many hidden under family and friends' names. Even worse, she approved the level of care and daily payment amounts for each client, ranging from $100 to over $700 a day, and always assigned the highest payments to her own homes. Clients were forcefully uprooted, even for minor infractions such as visiting a friend. Support coordinators were bribed to bring her good clients. The trauma to these individuals, whose group homes were effectively their homes, was devastating. This was essentially trafficking, with the woman earning over $1 million a month. Despite the Department of Justice becoming involved and hopes for accountability, deals were made behind the scenes. Charges never stuck, and protocols were quietly changed. She lost her job, paid some restitution, but lives were ruined. Now, shockingly, she owns a consulting company in the same industry. Story 21. I worked in a well-known online retail store's warehouse for 4 months as a packer, making $3 more than minimum wage. I stood in one spot for 10 hours a day, 4 days a week, packing orders. It was the closest thing I can imagine to modern-day slavery, with 3 days off to catch up on everything you couldn't do during the workdays. We weren't allowed radios or any distractions. The air had no circulation, and the endless beeping of scanners and alarms drove everyone crazy. At any given time, multiple red alarm buttons would be going off. There were strict quotas, and if you didn't meet them, you got in trouble and risked getting fired. Other packers begged me to slow down so the rates wouldn't rise, but I kept working fast. Once the rates went up, everyone struggled to keep up, and I became an outcast. The company used a point system for tardiness and absences. If you accumulated enough points in a month, you were automatically fired, no exceptions. Breaks were minimal and didn't include walking time to the lunchroom. When a new lunchroom was built behind metal detectors, you couldn't even have your phone with you during breaks. Managers treated employees like children and spoke down to them. The workforce was mostly immigrants and vulnerable people, making communication difficult and allowing management to treat them harshly. I got appendicitis 2 months into the job and had surgery. I was allowed only 1 week off to recover before having to return with stitches or get points for absence. I refused to work multi-large packages and was yelled at but permitted to do smaller tasks. On my final day after resigning, they assigned me the worst job, manually scanning problem packages and applying shipping labels by hand for 10 hours straight, under intense pressure to go faster. The stress was overwhelming, and I walked off the job, something I'd never done before. By the end, I contemplated offing myself, which was terrifying. Most people quit within the first month or two. The conditions are so brutal, no one should have to work in this warehouse. Story 22. I worked as an intern at a corn milling and ethanol plant that blew up this year. 5 people perished in the explosion, and others were permanently maimed. Based on what I saw while working there, I wasn't terribly surprised by the news. The safety manager was basically paid to look the other way and say everything was safe. Once I had to do a whole watch for someone entering a silo without any training. They weren't tied off to anything, meaning if the person passed out from gas fumes, someone else would have to enter wearing a full respirator to save them. They could have easily used a tie-off to prevent such risks. If anything went wrong, the worker would have died before the fire department could have rescued them. Although the higher-ups liked me, the lack of attention to safety and competent management kept me from applying for a full-time position. I moved to a better company for a while, but decided to leave the milling industry altogether because it's dangerous and even the new company wasn't following OSHA rules properly. Needless to say, I'm getting out of the milling industry. Story 23. I used to bus tables at a high-class restaurant in small-town Minnesota that had a lot of dirty secrets. Most employees made less than minimum wage. I made $4 an hour while the restaurant reported $10 an hour. No one complained because we were all trying to work our way up to become servers. You'd spend years underpaid, but servers could make insane money. A slow night still brought in about $500 in 5 hours. I knew servers who made $200K a year, mostly tax-free since tips weren't reported. You might think that to earn that much, servers had to be really good. Not true. People constantly screwed up orders and caused chaos. Some employees even had banging sessions on the same counters where food was prepared. Employees put bodily fluids in food for patrons they disliked. This isn't just a movie cliché. Management didn't care since they were often waiting tables too, sometimes even joining in the antics. There was heavy alcohol and drug use on the job. Some chefs joked that there was more drugs than flour in the pizza dough because they did lines on the countertop before starting their shifts. This was my first job, and I didn't realize how bad things were, but it taught me a lesson. If you have enough money or cater to the rich, the rules don't apply. Just pay off the right people, and you can get away with anything. Story 24. I worked as mall security for a while and was assigned to Sears. Although I was technically their staff, my responsibilities included opening and locking the store, performing security checks, and catching shoplifters. It became obvious very quickly that Sears had little to no concern for safety, security, or following proper protocols. During my daily walkthroughs, I regularly found issues like unlocked doors and broken theft detection systems. Out of 14 theft detectors across the store, 2 at each entrance, only 1 actually worked. One of the most serious problems involved Code Adam, the missing child protocol. Normally this code requires an immediate response, but during my first Code Adam, I was told to wait 5 minutes before making the announcement. This completely violated company policy. When I raised concerns with the manager, she simply said, "That's just how we do it," and I was discouraged from reporting the violation. The customers could be equally problematic. Some people would take clothes into the fitting rooms, defecate on them, and then leave. Since Sears had no cleaning service, I witnessed employee wiping feces off a piece of clothing on the floor and putting it back on the rack. The auto shop was also full of theft. Employees would bring in cars, do repairs, and then mark the job as an invalid entry in the system, so the parts would disappear from the records. When I reported this, the manager brushed it off and told me not to file a report. In terms of hazardous materials, there was very poor storage. Due to limited space, dangerous cleaning supplies were stored in public areas, right next to customer merchandise. Sears also had some absurd loss prevention policies. If someone stole less than $25 worth of items, we weren't allowed to stop them even if they did it repeatedly. If we lost sight of a suspect at any point, we also couldn't detain them, since it could be claimed they no longer had the merchandise. Wrongfully detaining someone known as a non-productive detainment, or NPD, could lead to major lawsuits and payouts. Lastly, security guards at most retail chains like Sears, Macy's, and Target are not legally allowed to physically stop or detain anyone unless they've had special training and licensing, which most stores won't pay for. If someone does try to stop you and they're not a police officer, you can legally keep walking. In short, Sears was a mess. I was told not to report things. Their security system was barely functional. Customer behavior was disgusting. Theft was constant, and safety was not a priority in any sense. Story 25. I worked in the furniture department at well-known discount retail chain, and to put it bluntly, the place was incredibly shady. I eventually walked out in the middle of a shift because I couldn't take it anymore. One major issue was the protection plans we were forced to sell. These plans sounded comprehensive, but were actually very limited. For example, if a customer had a recliner and used the plan to fix a cushion, they couldn't later use the same plan to fix the footrest if it broke, even within the coverage period. Employees were trained specifically not to tell customers about these restrictions. Our weekly work hours were tied to how many protection plans, rewards signups, and credit card applications we pushed, not based on how well we did our actual jobs. In contrast to the upselling, the return policy was absurdly lenient. Customers could return furniture they had for years, even if it was clearly destroyed or stained. Like one recliner that was soaked in dog urine, they would receive full refunds, no questions asked. Some customers figured out they could abuse this policy to upgrade furniture every year for free. While this was great for customers, it made it impossible to sell protection plans, and our sales numbers suffered. As a result, employees were often verbally reprimanded for too many returns, something completely outside of our control. The leasing program was another scam. Customers were told there was only a 10% upcharge, but that only applied if they paid off the lease within 3 months. What they weren't told was that the lease defaulted to a 12-month payment plan, which meant they'd end up paying nearly double the price. To avoid that, customers had to call the leasing company and specifically request a payment restructure, something most people never knew they had to do. We were trained to avoid telling them the truth about it, and the estimates we gave were based on the 12-month rate, which looked deceptively low. As for employee treatment, there was no real path to promotion. Each store only had around 5 full-time positions, and managers often lied about opportunities for advancement. Most employees were scheduled for 29.75 hours per week to avoid being eligible for benefits. Shifts were usually split into 6 short days to avoid triggering lunch break requirements, which made it feel like you were working constantly but never earning enough. Raises were incredibly rare, and when they happened, they were usually just 5 cents. It got worse. Some weeks I would be overworked with multiple open-to-close shifts, only to have my hours cut the next week to offset overtime. If I picked up a shift for someone on my only day off, my next schedule would still get cut as balance. It was a constant cycle of exhaustion and underpayment. Say or harassment was also ignored. At my store, there was a male employee who regularly behaved inappropriately with female coworkers, made sexist and racist remarks, and even harassed customers, including threatening a Muslim woman's husband. Multiple complaints were made, but management refused to fire him because handling the paperwork was too much work. Lastly, the rewards program was a joke. There were no points or real benefits. The exclusive coupons for rewards members were printed in stacks at the register and handed to everyone. Any member-only sales went public the next day. Still, we were required to aggressively push the program to every customer or risk losing hours. Story 26. I worked as a pet care manager at 2 stores, and we always took the animals to a small pet vet if they were sick. The issue wasn't the diagnosis, it was the follow-through. Often we had to administer the prescribed medications ourselves, and unfortunately not everyone in the department was as diligent or attentive as they should have been. We were trained to refuse a sale if a customer didn't have the appropriate setup or equipment to care for a pet properly. I agree though, hamsters can be terrifying little cannibals. That said, I did have several grievances with the company. For instance, while the animals were supposedly sourced from reputable breeders, in practice we often received groups of guinea pigs infected with ringworm. Treating ringworm is frustrating enough, but in a retail environment, it's especially difficult to eradicate completely. Reptiles would often arrive extremely young, stressed, and dehydrated, conditions that can lead to premature death if the animal doesn't recover quickly. Turtles and tortoises were frequently wild-caught, not captive-bred, which increases the risk of disease and makes them more likely to spread illness to other reptiles. Here's a tip. If you're ever looking for a free animal, ask the staff if they have any adoptable birds, reptiles, or small pets. These are usually animals that didn't sell fast enough, have grown too old to stay with others, or have a permanent but non-contagious issue, like a missing tail or head tilt. There's usually a process to make sure the animal won't be used as feeder food and that you have the right setup, but it doesn't hurt to ask. Most of these animals are kept in the back and can stay there for weeks or months, waiting for someone to adopt them. One major issue I observed was chronic understaffing. Corporate allocates a specific number of labor hours per store per week, and we weren't allowed to go over that limit. As a result, the store often operated on a skeleton crew. This affected not just customer service but also the level of care the animals received, simply because there weren't enough people to handle all the responsibilities. Story 27. During my 1-year tenure at a shoe store, I experienced and witnessed deeply troubling behavior that was mishandled by management. One of my male coworkers was well known among the staff for persistently hitting on female employees. Unfortunately, I became one of his targets. At the time, I was in an unhappy relationship, and I regretfully accepted his advances on multiple occasions. Later, I discovered that this same coworker had targeted another female colleague. When she rejected him, he said her. She reported the incident to our manager, but rather than take appropriate action, the company chose to disregard the matter. The coworker retained his position, likely due to the fact that he was one of only 2 male employees at the store. After I left my previous relationship and began seeing someone new, I ended all personal interactions with him. However, he went on to SA me as well while we were at work. I did not report the incident formally because I had already witnessed how the company handled or failed to handle similar complaints. Instead, I asked someone else to confront him on my behalf. That same day, after my boss had been informed and the matter was reported to the corporate office, I resigned from my position without notice. Despite this second report, the individual was allowed to remain employed for another month before he eventually left on his own. In the 1.5 years he worked there, he was also involved in multiple incidents of misconduct, including theft of merchandise and cash. Management was aware of these behaviors but chose to ignore them, apparently prioritizing the need to retain male staff in an otherwise female-dominated environment. This experience remains upsetting to me to this day. However, I have since moved on to a better job with higher pay. As for him, he is now employed at McDonald's, earning roughly the same wage he did at the shoe store. Story 28. I worked at an awful pet store that sold dogs. We all knew the prices of every dog by heart, but if a customer asked, we had to pretend not to know. We'd bring the dog out for them to play with, even if the customer specifically asked us not to, so they'd get attached. Meanwhile, I'd be in the back pretending to look up the price. Then, once they were all bonded with the dog, I'd have to tell them that instead of the $300 or so they were expecting, it would actually cost around $2,500. Cue tears. Lots of tears. We had to tell customers all sorts of nonsense to justify the price, including that the dogs were registered. One customer came back absolutely furious because the dog wasn't actually registered. It turned out management meant the dogs were registerable, but they never told us that. That's just one example of the many terrible things I put up with there. I'm a pretty honest person. Guilt really affects me more than most, and all that intense lying made me extremely depressed. I quit after only 3 months. Story 29. This might get me in trouble, but screw it. I'm ready to defend my words. I worked for a company that provides farming services, a company running hydroponic greenhouses and a fodder system with about 20 hogs and 12 steers. The guy in charge of animals and fodder maintenance had a very lax attitude about cleaning and sterilizing. I helped care for the animals on weekends and noticed black mold growing on the fodder trays and drain lines. I reported this, and his response was, "They step beef animals. They won't live long enough for mold to affect them." Weeks later, the steers started having seizures and foaming at the mouth. They suffered for nearly a week before dying. The VP didn't want to pay for vet visits or euthanasia, causing needless suffering. The farm manager barely let them be tested for mycotoxins, claiming the results were inconclusive. We were told not to say anything. The manager wasn't reprimanded. The company prefers hiring and promoting locals and family members and fires others for less. That event still haunts me. I left the company shortly after. I plan to post this on their Glassdoor where they have a 2.1 rating for other reasons. The president pressures sales staff to post fake positive reviews to combat negative ones. There are other terrible issues at the company, but I won't go into them here. Story 30. I used to work for a well-known beauty product company. It's one of those annoying kiosks in Canada. The store I worked at was not in Victoria. First, we were only supposed to talk to people who showed interest, like looking at the kiosk, so no active soliciting, but my Israeli boss would badger me to ask everyone, claiming Israelis were better salespeople but couldn't get any to Canada yet. We had no listed prices, only a minimum price. For example, a nail kit had a minimum price of $15, but I was told to start selling it at $89.99. If someone wasn't interested, I'd say it was buy one get one, and if still no, I'd pretend to use a calculator to offer a discount of around $40. If that was still too much, I'd throw in free soap and lotion to keep the store profitable. We were told to physically hold on to customers when giving lotion samples and buff one of their nails, telling them they could come back for new buffer pads, which were crappy and replaced daily. The worst trick was the serum, sold for upwards of $100. We'd put serum on one arm and lotion on the other, rubbing the serum-injected arm with care and the other quickly and poorly. Customers never caught on and were amazed, buying the overpriced serum. I especially felt bad for the elderly who bought after the first price or when my boss made fake claims that the products cured psoriasis and other ailments. My boss wanted $1,000 in sales daily and would give days off without pay if we didn't meet that quota. I only hit $1,000 once with his help and pressure. I quit as soon as I found another job. A month later. Story 31. I briefly worked night shifts at a care home. It was just me and one other staff member per shift, responsible for about 15 mostly bedbound and confused residents. The worst situation was during a diarrhea outbreak. There was only one box of gloves left for the entire night shift because the privately owned home was cutting costs. Gloves were the only protective equipment provided. Neither of us on night shift were senior staff and didn't have keys to the medication room where more gloves were stored. We ran out of gloves. Our choices were to refuse to work without proper protection, meaning residents would remain in heavily soiled sheets, or grit our teeth and clean up with bare hands, risking infection. I chose the latter and scrubbed myself clean as best I could afterward. This went on for several nights. By the time we got more gloves, the outbreak was almost over. I don't know how care was during the day, but the place passed a care quality inspection while I was there. I'm pretty sure they faked it. I quit ASAP and will never go back to care work. It takes a special kind of strength. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.